Ukraine claims its strikes on 15 Russian aircraft have cost the Kremlin $1 billion as the butcher's bill from 4 years of war looks set to hit 2 million casualties this year. And Moscow is trying to convince America that it's ready to de-escalate. Kyiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defense editor at the Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. Spectacular footage has been released this week by Ukraine's SBU intelligence service showing strikes against 15 Russian aircraft. This was not, as first thought, a new operation. This was a greatest hits compilation of long-range strikes against 5 separate airfields, at least 4 of which are in Crimea. They show strikes against Mi-28 helicopter gunships, attack helicopters, Mi-8 and Mi-28 heavy lift helicopters, 1 Antonov 26 An-26 cargo plane, and the fighter jets and bombers. That's a Sukhoi 30, a Sukhoi 34, 27 Sukhoi 24, and a MiG-31. Now, aviation experts, the plane spotters, have come out and questioned that estimate of whether those aircraft, those 15 aircraft combined, are worth $1 billion. The SBU claiming that that price was calculated by combining the value of the aircraft and the ammunition and the fuel and other equipment on those airfields that was also damaged. What's interesting about this, two things. This is separate to Operation Spider's Web, and significantly, it comes in a week. It was released in a week when there are credible reports, unconfirmed but credible reports, that 2 Russian aircraft were shot down over the Black Sea just days ago. That's a Su-30 and an Su-34 that were appearing to probe defences around Odessa. Those 15 aircraft represent approximately a third of Russia's aircraft production. This is a significant blow, but unlikely to be game-changing in the long run. All of this, though, comes amid an absolutely dire, really dire assessment of Russia's campaign that's been published by CSIS, the US think tank, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Among their many staggering analyses is that Russia is making the slowest advance on at least 3 of its major fronts in Ukraine, the slowest advance in over 100 years of warfare, of major conflicts, combined arms maneuver warfare. So that is slower, for example, than the Battle of the Somme. The examples they focus on are the Russian offensive in Chasiv Yar, so that's west of Bakhmut. That's where Russian forces have got after taking Bakhmut. Kupyansk in the north in Kharkiv region, and Pokrovsk, which we talked so much about on recent episodes. So in Chasiv Yar, CIS is saying Russian forces are averaging 15 meters a day. In Kupyansk, around 20, just over 20 meters a day, and in Pokrovsk, slightly more, 70 meters a day. But all of that is less than the average advance, about 80 meters a day, on the Western Front in the Battle of the Somme. Some places, Russia is making faster advances. Huliapole, significantly, that's sort of in Zaporizhia Oblast. Their Russian forces have been making gains of about 300 meters a day. And we've talked before how Ukrainian and Western officials have suggested that the Russian commanders there are significantly more aggressive and putting down those advances to more competent Russian military command. But compare those snail's pace advances of Russia with the kilometer a day that Ukraine managed to take when it invaded Russian Kursk. I know that didn't last forever. The CSIS report also looks at other conflicts. Israel's Yom Kippur War in 1973, where Israel's forces advanced 5,000 meters, 5 kilometers per day, and Ukraine's counteroffensive in the first year of the war in Kharkiv, in that first autumn of the war, where its troops made those lightning advances up to 7 kilometers in a single day. Separately, the Institute for the Study of War, another US-based think tank which has been following this conflict so closely, estimates that on the current rates of advance, Russia would take another 2 years to capture what remains of the Donbass. That is primarily what remains of Donetsk province. And that's the territory, it's worth remembering that Moscow wants Ukraine to cede voluntarily, to give up the territory that Russia has been unable to capture by force that it wants as part of any peace deal. Now set those incredibly slow gains against the incredibly high cost. The CSIS report has collated estimates of casualties for both sides. And whilst there is a large margin of error because both sides go to great lengths to conceal the true cost of this conflict, particularly the human cost, they estimate that Russian casualties, dead, wounded, missing, are up to 1.2 million people, of which up to 325,000 have been killed. On the other side, Ukraine suffering around half the number of casualties, according to this estimate, up to 600,000 casualties, including dead, wounded, missing, of which this report suggests up to 140,000 have been killed in action. Those figures are huge. It's a cliche to say that one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. When we contemplate them, it's hard to fathom. But to put it into some sort of context, in the Korean War, America lost about 55,000 troops. That was its worst conflict since World War II. 47,000 soldiers Americans lost in Vietnam. Russia, official reported casualties from its 10-year conflict in Afghanistan was 15,000. That's fatalities. Now, the outrage, the anger at the loss of those soldiers felt by the Russian mothers, by the soldiers' mothers, is what contributed in no small part to Russia's retreat, defeat in Afghanistan, and ultimately it contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So worth remembering that there is a lot at stake for Russia, a huge amount at stake for Russia, a huge amount at stake for President Putin. But what is perhaps slightly depressing is the way that the Kremlin is managing to suppress any organised sense of grief and anger at the human cost of the conflict. And all of that perhaps explains why I was given a very, very bleak assessment of where the war is at this week by senior sources who are well placed to know, suggesting that all of that pain that Russia is suffering, the long-range strikes that Ukraine has been successfully delivering, have not changed Vladimir Putin's strategic calculus on this war. He still thinks he can win. He still thinks it is worth pursuing the same tactics to try and win. He thinks Russia can absorb the pain. Now, that doesn't mean there are not big problems in Russia. Recruitment is getting harder. Inflation is soaring. Businesses, the economy is suffering. It doesn't mean that he won't reach a breaking point, but the question is which country reaches breaking point first. And I think Ukraine and its allies realize that this is a precarious situation for all involved. So therefore, what should we make of US and Russian claims this week that Trump has asked Putin to stop strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure in Kyiv and other cities? There's some confusion because Trump says Putin has agreed to this. He said that that was very nice of Vladimir Putin. The Kremlin's account is slightly different. They are saying this only lasts until February the 1st, so until midway through the next week. And Ukraine is looking at what's happened. There hasn't been a major strike on Kyiv's energy infrastructure since January the 24th. But on January 27th, there was a big strike against Odessa, the southern port city of Odessa, including energy infrastructure, that it left at least 3 people dead. And overnight on January 30th, another 111 missiles and drones fired at Ukraine, leaving at least 6 people dead. There are still hundreds of buildings across the country, but particularly in Kyiv, without heating or power, and temperatures are well below 0 degrees, well below freezing. It is a dire situation. People are dying of hypothermia. President Zelensky's assessment is that Russia has switched its focus from hitting energy infrastructure to transport. And we've seen horrific footage this week of a Russian drone strike against a passenger train in Kharkiv, and reports coming in today of an artillery strike on a bus in Kherson. Zelensky described that attack on the train as a terrorist attack, and I think it's easy to see why he would say that. This was a passenger train packed with people, packed with civilians, hit clearly deliberately by a volley of drones. 55,000 Russian drones fired at Ukraine last year, a five-fold increase on the year before. Moscow appears to be trying to show Donald Trump that Putin is willing to de-escalate, to try and present the Russians as the reasonable party in these peace negotiations. I think anyone who's watched this conflict as closely as we have will be very, very wary of that suggestion. Because what we've also seen in parallel, of course, is Zelensky making a very genuine offer to meet Vladimir Putin on neutral turf to try and agree a peace, and the Kremlin countering that Zelensky is welcome to come to Moscow, that meeting can happen, but it can only happen in Moscow. And that is absolutely a false invitation. It is a disingenuous, dishonest pretense at wanting to talk, because there are countless examples through history of Russia pretending that it's willing to negotiate with its enemies, and when they come onto Russian territory, those enemies or challengers being arrested or killed. A notable example, 1945, 16 Polish resistance leaders invited by with the blessing of Joseph Stalin to Russia, and they were put on trial. There were no negotiations, there was no proper process. As we look at the front lines this week, they really do not appear to have moved very much, and that's no surprise given what we've been talking about in terms of rates of advance. Interestingly, in Kupyansk, in northern Kharkiv, there are claims Russia has been there's been renewed fighting there. Russia has gained ground, but it hasn't been entirely one way. There's a suggestion that the Russian troops who are holding out in Kupyansk, one analysis suggesting that they are bait, and that Ukraine hasn't sort of pushed through because by leaving a small number of soldiers there forces the Russians to try and resupply them along a particularly precarious and vulnerable supply route. That is one analysis. These are unconfirmed. Obviously, both sides have a persistent interest in putting a positive spin on the situation, but I think worth watching. We will continue to watch what's happening in Kupyansk. A few amazing, extraordinary, unusual things that we've seen this week, because despite the monotony and the drudgery of this slaughter, there's still many opportunities for us to be surprised. Footage of 3 Russian soldiers in their snowsuits surrendering to a Ukrainian robot drone. The third one who emerges, that white snowsuit very heavily splattered with blood, suggesting that they'd had a pretty difficult time. I also saw photographs you may have seen of a Russian drone, looked like a Zala drone stuck, or a Lancet drone stuck in one of those anti-drone nets over the road. So proof in a way of how those nets can protect people underneath, although this drone appears to be going not fast enough or have exploded, which is why the net is in place. Just a reminder of what it must be like, how terrifying to drive under those drone nets. Footage from Ukrainian troops on the ground where they've managed to intercept the feed of a Russian drone that is targeting them. So the unencrypted analog signals that Russian drones are feeding back to their own drone operators can be intercepted, and that's a tactic both sides are using. And finally, footage of a low-flying Shahed drone reportedly being controlled sort of in real time by an operator. That would suggest a sort of shift in a way like the tactics that we've seen on FPV drones, where they're remote controlled, being used to guide Shahed drones or Geran drones very low to the ground in order to help them evade radar. Other disturbing reports we've seen this week that Iran may have supplied 350 missiles, long-range missiles or medium-range missiles to Russia, which have not yet been fired, suggesting that Russia may be stockpiling or planning some big assault with that. And finally, in terms of disturbing reports, that the US firm Ubiquity is continuing to supply indirectly, but nonetheless parts from this US firm, supplying Russian forces with vital communications equipment, which is enabling them to continue fighting and prosecuting the war. If you've got any questions, as ever, please do ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next week. We've got 3 to get through today. Would Russia deploy a small tactical nuclear weapon? It's a very good question. We've talked about it before, but not for a while. In the first autumn of the war, there were alarming intelligence reports picked up by the United Kingdom that Russia was indeed planning to do just that. It may have been a demonstration strike, perhaps over the Black Sea, as a signal of intent. And that initiated a panicked few days of diplomacy, which saw our then Defense Secretary traveling to Washington. It saw the Americans engaging the Indians and the Chinese to deliver a very clear message to Moscow that they must on no account turn this into a nuclear conflict. But I think that showed us that it was something Russia was contemplating. Question number 2, who is losing more troops per day? Well, we've talked about those casualty figures slightly already. Over the course of the war, those estimates that Russia is losing around twice as many soldiers, and that's likely primarily because Russia is attacking, and any attacking force will suffer a higher rate of attrition, and also partly down to just Russia's relentlessly ruthless tactics and the willingness of its military commanders to sacrifice so many of their men for such modest gains. So I'll roll 2 questions into one because they're both about weapons production. The first part is, could Germany's auto industry sort of switch to making weapons? It's a really good question because that's exactly the sort of thing that happened during World War II. Companies that brands that we might know now, like Bosch, were in fact weapons manufacturers during World War II. The answer is yes, hypothetically. Are they going to? Do they need to at the moment? No. Germany does have a large and effective sort of arms industry, dedicated arms industry, companies like Rheinmetall, which make tanks, which make the Leopard tanks. That industry is increasing production because of the increase in investment coming from Berlin. And how long, sort of linked question, how long before Europe and the UK really scale up shell production to supply Ukraine? Europe and the UK have scaled up shell production. Whether it's enough to supply Ukraine, I think, remains very controversial, unlikely. But since that decision to scale up artillery production was made, of course, other weapons have become increasingly important, most notably the drones, the cheap, attritable one-way attack drones and interceptor drones. And Europe and the UK ramping up production of those to try and help Ukraine. Is it enough? Well, not yet. And we heard from President Zelensky this week, talking about Patriot missiles, talking about how he just doesn't have enough Patriot missiles, how there was a shortage, there was a delay on a delivery, and that simply opened the doors to a massive Russian strike. Thank you for watching. If you do have questions, please ask them in the comments below, and I look forward to answering as many as I can next week.